The wind had no mercy that evening. It howled like a pack of wolves across the plains, rattling shutters and biting into the skin like cold steel. Most men stayed inside on nights like that, beside firewood stacks, whiskey bottles, and silence. But not him. The rancher had always believed that kindness was a man's truest legacy. That belief would be tested in a way he never imagined, when a shivering shadow appeared near his barn, barely more than a child, wrapped in tattered cloth and frostbite. She didn't speak at first, just stared with wide, hollow eyes. Her cheeks were raw, her fingers curled like brittle twigs. No one from the tribe had come this close to the ranch in months, not since the last snowfall buried the mountain trails. He didn't ask questions. He handed her his own soup, still steaming, and wrapped her in an old blanket from his saddlebag. It wasn't heroism. It was instinct. But some instincts unlock stories far older than any legend told around a campfire. That night, long after the rancher had returned to his porch and the girl had vanished back into the white silence, something happened. Under the full gaze of the winter moon, an old woman emerged from the trees. Her back was bent with years, her braids silvered like the snow, but her eyes were sharp, ancient, and filled with knowledge the rancher couldn't begin to understand. In her hand, she held a necklace, bone, turquoise, and leather, worn only in sacred unions of her people. She didn't knock. She didn't speak. She simply placed the necklace on his porch and disappeared into the dark, as if swallowed by the night itself. What he held in his hands wasn't just a gift. It was a sign, a message that echoed far beyond the reach of language, one that would stir ghosts, awaken loyalties, and reveal a destiny he never saw coming. What could a bowl of soup mean to a stranger? What might one act of warmth awaken in the soul of a forgotten people? And why would a grandmother offer a wedding necklace to a man she'd never met? This isn't just a story of kindness. It's a tale of prophecy, ancient vows, and the wild, sacred ways of the West, where one good deed could bind two worlds forever. The next morning, the rancher stood on his porch, boots creaking against the frosted wood, staring down at the necklace left behind. It was no ordinary trinket. The weight of it in his hand was more than physical. It carried a kind of warmth, as though it still held the memory of old hands and older prayers. The beads were smooth from generations of touch, the turquoise still vibrant despite its age. He'd seen pieces like this only once before, during a trade with an elder from a northern tribe. But never had he held one meant for marriage. Confused but respectful, he wrapped the necklace in cloth and kept it close. He knew enough of the land to understand that not everything demanded an explanation. In the West, some answers came through silence, through time, through trial. And so, he waited. Days passed, and though the girl never returned, her presence lingered. He caught himself leaving extra food out, checking the barn more often, even brushing the horse she'd looked at so curiously that night. The rancher began to ask around the neighboring ranches and trade posts, subtly at first. Most folks just shook their heads or changed the subject. The tribes had grown wary, and the white settlers, even the kind ones, knew there were wounds between the two worlds that hadn't fully healed. Still, one old trapper mentioned something peculiar, a tale passed down about a sacred child born during the snow moon, destined to unite her people with a stranger through an act of grace. The rancher laughed it off, but not entirely. At night, by the fire, the rancher would find himself turning the necklace over and over in his hands, tracing the etchings carved into each piece. He began to dream of songs he'd never heard before, sung in a language he couldn't understand, yet somehow recognized. Faces he'd never seen appeared in those dreams, proud faces, weathered by sun and time, watching him with neither judgment nor praise. Just waiting. He didn't know it yet, but the West had chosen him. Not by lineage, not by conquest, but by heart. And when the West calls a man, it does so quietly, with wind and signs and strangers who vanish in the cold. But once called, a man cannot go back to who he was. The trail changes. The land watches. And somewhere beyond the trees, an old woman was watching too, waiting for the next step in a story far older than the rancher himself. The snow began to melt in early spring, revealing the scars of the long winter, broken branches, faded tracks, the half-buried memories of storms survived. The rancher, hardened by seasons, kept to his routine, but there was a subtle shift in his movements. He was listening more closely, walking further from the ranch house, following trails he might have ignored before. The land felt different now, almost as if it were breathing beside him. One morning, just past dawn, he found something tied to the fence post near his grazing fields, a bundle wrapped in animal hide, sealed with a strip of braided grass. Inside were herbs, dried berries, and a small piece of folded cloth with markings painted in red clay, symbols of blessing, or perhaps warning. He didn't recognize them, but he felt their meaning all the same. The rancher didn't touch them. He simply bowed his head and left them where they were, out of respect. By week's end, he noticed signs of movement around his land, small footprints near the creek, bits of ash where no fire should have been. Not intrusions, just visitations. The rancher didn't feel fear. He felt watched, not in a hostile way, but like a man being measured by a silent jury hidden in the trees. So he continued to act as he always had. Honest work, gentle hands with animals, silence at sunset. He knew someone was observing how he lived, and he wanted to be worthy of the attention. One afternoon, he saw her again. The girl, only for a moment, on the ridge near the horizon, her silhouette framed by the clouds. She didn't wave. She didn't move. But she was older now, not in body, but in bearing. She stood straighter. Her eyes no longer looked desperate. They looked knowing. Then she vanished into the wind, like a vision conjured by memory. The rancher knew then something was beginning. The necklace hadn't been a thank you. It had been a question, and his answer wasn't in words, but in how he chose to walk forward. The West doesn't test a man through trials of might, but of spirit. How he feeds the hungry, how he honors the land, how he faces the silence. The old woman, whoever she was, hadn't given him a token. She placed a burden on his soul, a calling, and soon, that calling would come to claim him fully. By midsummer, the rancher noticed the air itself seemed to carry whispers, not sounds, but sensations. Trees swayed in stillness, animals paused at odd moments, and the sky held a quiet tension, like a drum stretched tight. The dreams grew stronger. Now he saw the girl beside a river, cloaked in white, with her hands raised toward the stars. Always watching, always silent. And behind her, the old woman with the moon in her eyes. It no longer felt like imagination. It felt like memory, borrowed from another life. One evening, as the sun dipped low and fireflies lit up the edge of the field, the rancher found smoke rising in the distance. He followed it through brush and trail, heart steady, step certain. There, deep in the woods, was a circle of stones, blackened by flame, and beside it a gift. A wooden bowl carved with intricate patterns, and inside, a piece of bark with more of the red clay symbols, the same color as the necklace beads. He touched the bowl gently, and for the first time in weeks, he whispered aloud, "I see you." The next morning, a young man from the nearby town came riding hard, his horse dusted with sweat. He warned of settlers passing through who had no love for natives, men with rifles and loud mouths, heading north. The rancher's land sat square in their path. The visitor rode off quickly, but the word stayed behind. The rancher looked out toward the trees, toward the place he'd seen the girl last, and something inside him stirred, a blend of worry and a duty he didn't yet understand. He began preparing quietly, not for battle, but for shelter. He stocked food, water, extra tools. He repaired the old barn's back wall and checked every latch. When a man has nothing but his hands and his word, protection doesn't come through weapons. It comes through readiness. If the girl returned, or her people needed a place to breathe, he would be ready, not because he was asked, but because the necklace still rested above his heart each night. The West has a way of shaping a man without force. It whispers, it tests, and if he listens, it gives him a purpose greater than the soil he tills. The rancher was no longer waiting for answers. He was becoming one, a bridge between silence and understanding, between past and present, and far beyond the tree line. Old eyes watched with approval. The story was unfolding just as it was meant to, slow, rooted, and full of fire yet to come. The trouble arrived at dusk, cloaked in laughter and the clatter of horseshoes on hard ground. For riders, loud, cruel-eyed, with the stink of entitlement on their breath, came through the South Trail, demanding water and whiskey. The rancher gave them water, nothing more. He watched their eyes scan his land like vultures, saw the way one of them eyed the barn, and knew instinctively they weren't just passing through. They were looking to claim what wasn't theirs. They mocked the simplicity of the place, called the ranch a graveyard with sheep, and warned they'd be back for a proper visit. But what unsettled the rancher most wasn't their words. It was the absence of birdsong when they left. The land itself seemed to recoil, holding its breath. He stood at the gate long after the dust had settled, gripping the fence post until splinters worked into his palm. Trouble wasn't just coming. It had already chosen where to strike. That night, he lit no fire. He stayed by the barn, rifle in hand, though he hated its weight. As the moon climbed, he heard movement beyond the fields, not the riders, but something else. Footsteps soft as breath. He didn't raise his weapon. He waited. From the shadowed edge of the trees, the girl appeared once more. This time, she approached. No fear, no hesitation. She stopped just beyond the fence, and beside her, the old woman emerged, slower, leaning on a crooked staff carved with feathers and bone. They said nothing, but their presence was thunder. The girl placed her hand over her heart, then reached out and touched the top rail of the fence. The message was clear. This land, this man, they had been chosen. The grandmother then stepped forward, produced a handful of earth wrapped in cloth, and laid it at his feet. A blessing, a binding, a silent pact. And just like that, they vanished again into the dark, leaving behind a peace so heavy it nearly brought him to his knees. By morning, the rancher knew what had to be done. He wasn't just a protector of cattle now. He was the keeper of a promise, forged in frost, sealed in silence. The storm that approached would not be met with bullets alone, but with the quiet power of a man who stood in truth and the ancestral strength of a people who remembered everything. The land had drawn its lines, and his heart was one of them. 3 days passed with no sign of the riders, yet the tension only grew thicker in the air. The cattle moved restlessly, dogs barked at shadows, and even the wind seemed to whisper warnings through the grass. The rancher rose earlier, rested later. He walked the perimeter of his land every dawn, eyes alert, spirit still. Though he was alone in body, something deeper walked beside him. The weight of history, of promises made long before he was born, now resting on his shoulders. It was during one of these walks that he found them, tracks near the southern edge, hoofprints too fresh to ignore. He followed them into a grove of cottonwoods, where he discovered a crude campsite, cigar butts, bones from fresh kills, a rag with dried blood. The men were close, watching, waiting. He didn't panic. He simply returned to the ranch and added wood to the fire pile, double-checked the locks on the barn, and placed the wedding necklace in his breast pocket, close to the place where fear used to live. That night, the girl came again, not in silence, but in ceremony. Behind her walked 7 figures, cloaked in furs and feathers, their faces painted in symbols he could not name, but instinctively honored. They gathered in a circle near his barn, not seeking shelter, but offering protection. The grandmother, ever the last to arrive, stood at the center and whispered in a tongue older than the soil beneath their feet. The fire between them crackled, not from wood, but from spirit. The rancher didn't ask questions. He sat among them. He listened, and slowly, he began to understand, not through words, but through presence. These were not visitors. They were guardians. The wedding necklace had not been a suggestion of marriage. It was a covenant, a binding between 2 worlds, one of blood, one of choice. And he had chosen. When he gave soup to the girl, he opened a door that had remained shut for generations. Now, that door could not be closed. By morning, they were gone, leaving no trace but ash in the fire ring and a small carving of an eagle placed on his porch. He took it in his hands, ran his fingers over the wings, and whispered a vow to the morning sky. I'll stand. He didn't know what the days ahead would bring, but he knew this. A man's worth isn't measured by what he protects, but by who he's willing to stand for. And when the West chooses a man to carry its story, he must walk with both humility and fire. The next dusk brought thunder on the horizon, not from the sky, but from hooves. The 4 riders returned, eyes burning, words sharper than before. They circled his ranch like buzzards, laughing as they pointed at the fence, the barn, the empty fields. "You're keeping something," one of them spat. "And we'll have it, girl, gold, or ghost." The rancher stood silent. Behind him, the house glowed with a single oil lamp, the same flame that had lit his father's hands and his grandfather's prayers. He didn't brandish his rifle. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "This land's been spoken for." The men laughed, not understanding. But something in his stillness gave them pause. One dismounted, walked to the fence, and stared him down. "You think you can stop us alone?" The rancher looked past him, toward the trees, toward the silent guardians who had returned, their eyes sharp in the dusk, watching, waiting. The rider didn't see them, but he felt them. His breath hitched. The rancher spoke again. "I'm not alone." And in that moment, something shifted. A cry rose from the trees. Not human, not animal, but a sound born of legend, of wind and earth and the bones beneath it. The horses reared. The riders panicked. One bolted. Another dropped his reins. They fled, not from the man, but from what stood behind him, shadows wrapped in memory, a wall of presence too old to fight and too sacred to touch. When the dust settled, the rancher walked the fence line once more, slow and deliberate. He saw what the riders could not. A circle of footprints around his land, pressed gently into the earth, the kind that protect, not trap. He bowed his head, whispered thanks, and placed the eagle carving atop the gatepost, where it would face every sunrise from that day forward. The West had chosen. The girl had spoken. The grandmother had sealed. And the land had remembered. What began with a bowl of soup on a frozen night had become something greater than legacy. It had become legend. And legends, in the Old West, were not born from violence. They were born from choice, from kindness, and from the quiet strength of a man who simply stood. The season turned, and with it, the land softened. Snow became stream, wind gave way to breeze, and the wildflowers bloomed in gentle defiance of the winter that once threatened to swallow everything. The rancher worked as he always had, but now the air around him felt sacred. Animals moved differently when he passed. Birds lingered longer near his porch. Even the soil beneath his boots seemed to carry a hum, not of danger, but of presence. A rhythm older than any clock, beating steady with the heartbeat of the West. He hadn't seen the girl in weeks, but her memory lived in every step he took. The wedding necklace now hung by the front door, not as decoration, but as a reminder, a vow, a bridge, a quiet oath never to be broken. Occasionally, he'd find tokens left in hidden places, a feather bound in leather, berries arranged in a crescent moon, a strip of cloth marked with red clay. He didn't touch them. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that now tied him not just to a people, but to a story. Word of the riders spread quickly through nearby towns. They were last seen traveling east, their confidence broken, their mouths quiet. No one knew what had truly shaken them, only that something had. Some whispered of spirits, others of curses. But those who knew the land, who felt its breath and honored its scars, understood. They had trespassed against something sacred, and the West, in its way, had answered. One morning, as the rancher saddled his horse for the high trail, he saw smoke curling gently in the valley beyond. Not black smoke of destruction, but blue, sweet-smelling, ceremonial. He rode toward it, steady and calm, and found a small clearing where the tribe had gathered. The girl stood among them, tall now, her eyes no longer filled with fear, but with fire. The grandmother raised her hand, and without words, beckoned him to join the circle. There was no celebration, no drums, just silence, powerful, vast, and filled with meaning. The rancher removed his hat, stepped into the circle, and for the first time, felt the ground welcome him. The girl approached, holding a second necklace, this one carved of white bone and red stone. She placed it in his hands, and in doing so, placed her people's trust in him. It wasn't a marriage of bodies. It was a marriage of paths. The land had made its decision, and all present bore witness. From that day forward, the ranch was no longer just a place of cattle and fence lines. It became a threshold, a resting place between two worlds. Travelers who passed by often spoke of strange peace that surrounded the property, as if the land itself watched over it. Even the weather seemed to bend gently around its borders, rain falling softer, wind rustling kindly through the trees. Some called it luck. The rancher called it covenant. Children from the tribe began appearing on the ranch trails, not out of need, but out of curiosity. They brought gifts, carved stones, woven grasses, painted feathers, and listened to the rancher tell stories not of battles, but of kindness, of choices, of silent promises kept. In turn, they taught him their songs, songs that spoke of the mountain's breath, the river's memory, and the stars that guided dreams. And every evening, as the sky dimmed, the same girl would sit by the fence, watching the horizon, as if guarding the story they had begun together. One afternoon, the rancher received visitors, government men, dressed in press coats, eyes sharp with numbers and intentions. They spoke of land deeds, of surveys, of expansion. They offered coins and contracts, maps drawn without heart. The rancher said nothing. He led them to the gate, pointed to the eagle carving, and said only, "This land has been spoken for." And when they laughed and pressed harder, the wind rose behind them, a sudden, fierce gust that knocked off hats and sent papers flying. They left without looking back. That night, the girl returned, not alone, but with elders from her people. They brought with them a stone marked with 3 etchings, one for the land, one for the ancestors, and one for the living bond now sealed between them. They placed it at the base of the gatepost, beneath the eagle carving, and the rancher knew, no matter what storm might come, no force of man or greed could break what had been forged in frost, fire, and faith. In the West, stories don't end. They settle, like dust on old boots, like songs passed down in whispers. And on that ranch, surrounded by hills and memory, a man who once offered soup to a freezing girl now stood at the center of something far greater than himself. A legacy not written in books, but carved into the very earth. Eternal, unshakable, and still unfolding. The seasons rolled on, as they always do in the West, with quiet authority. Summer faded into gold, and the first chill of autumn crept over the ridges. The rancher aged, though no one could say by how much. His hands bore more lines, but his eyes carried a steadiness that seemed carved from mountain stone. The tribe continued to visit, not out of tradition now, but out of belonging. Children laughed near the stables. Elders walked the fields, as if retracing stories their ancestors had once told in secret. He and the girl, now a woman in her own right, seldom spoke with words. Their bond didn't need language. She would arrive at twilight, often barefoot, with a small offering in hand, wildflowers, a feather, a smooth river stone. He'd nod, tip his hat, and offer her a place near the porch. They would sit in silence, sharing the same sunset, the same stillness. In the Old West, that was communion, not just between souls, but between worlds. One evening, after the first frost kissed the grass, the woman brought a piece of parchment, aged, frayed, and painted with symbols. She unrolled it slowly, revealing a map, not of land, but of memory. The rancher recognized some markings from his dreams: the river where she had once stood, the grove where the old woman had offered him the earth, and a new place, a ridge with no name, marked with a sun and 3 dots. She pointed to it, and then to the horizon. It was time. The next morning, he rode out alone, following the map not with fear, but reverence. His horse trotted softly, as if sensing the journey's weight. When he reached the ridge, he dismounted and walked. There, beneath an ancient tree split by lightning, he found them, stones arranged in a spiral, with a fire pit at the center. No one else was there, yet the place felt full. He knelt, placed the second necklace over the stones, and closed his eyes. He didn't hear voices. He felt them, all of them. The girl, the grandmother, the ones who had walked before, the land, the silence, everything that had led him from a simple act of kindness to this sacred threshold. And as he stood once more, a wind swept through the ridge, carrying with it the scent of cedar, smoke, and soup. A promise had been fulfilled, a bond completed. But the story, as always in the West, was far from over. Winter returned like a soft hymn, not harsh this time, but solemn. Snow blanketed the ranch, covering the fields in white silence. The cattle huddled close, the barn lights flickered gently, and the world slowed. The rancher no longer waited for signs. He no longer questioned the why of things. He simply lived in alignment, with the land, with the tribe, with the story that had found him on a cold night and never let go. Visitors came less often, but when they did, they brought respect in their eyes. Young men seeking guidance, old men seeking peace. They asked not for riches or history, but for the story. The one about the necklace, the one about the girl, the one about the night when a simple act turned a man into something more. And the rancher, in his weathered voice, would tell it slowly, not to impress, but to preserve. The woman came fewer times now, but when she did, she stayed longer. Sometimes for days. She'd help with the horses, mend the fence, hum songs under her breath. Once she brought a child, hers, and the rancher felt something bloom quietly in his chest. He gave the boy a carved eagle and said, "This belongs to the land. And now so do you." The boy said nothing, just nodded, the way the girl had done, all those years ago. On the night of the first true snowfall, the rancher lit a fire by the porch and stood alone. The stars above shimmered like old promises, and the wind whispered not warnings, but welcome. He looked to the trees, half expecting to see the old woman one last time. And maybe he did. Maybe just for a second. A flicker of silver hair, a staff, eyes like moonlight. Or maybe the land was simply remembering her too. In the West, the greatest stories aren't shouted. They're planted, like seeds in snow, like prayers in silence. And on that ranch, where soup was once shared with a freezing girl, a legacy still burns, not in flames, but in quiet embers. Steady, eternal, and waiting for the next rider to carry it forward. Some stories are not meant to be shouted from rooftops, but whispered across generations, through the way a gate swings open for a stranger, or how a bowl of soup is offered with no questions asked. What happened on that ranch wasn't just the tale of a man and a girl. It was the unveiling of a truth we too often forget, that kindness, when given freely, plants roots far deeper than we can ever see. In a land carved by hardship and dust, one gentle act forged a bond strong enough to outlast storms, silence, and time itself. The rancher never sought glory. He never asked for thanks. Yet in giving warmth to a freezing soul, he became the heartbeat of something ancient, a legacy written not in ink, but in footsteps across frozen ground, and in necklaces passed hand to hand like sacred fire. Through every season, he showed us what it means to carry responsibility without being asked, to protect what isn't ours, and to listen to the land when it speaks in quiet signs. There was no hero's medal, no town parade, just a man who understood that history is shaped by the ones who stay when others walk away. And maybe that's what the West has always tried to teach us, that the strongest among us are not those who conquer, but those who choose to stand still, to build something sacred, and to let it grow. The ranch became a sanctuary, not because of its fences, but because of its heart. And now, perhaps you're wondering what it all means for you. Maybe you've been rushing through life, missing the quiet calls, the frozen girl at your door, the necklace on your porch, the map in someone's eyes. Maybe it's time to ask, what small act of kindness will echo through your story? What legacy will you leave not with your words, but with your hands, your choices, your stillness? If this story stirred something in you, even if just a flicker, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, ones that carry truth through silence and meaning through memory. Like the video if it moved you, and share in the comments what moment spoke loudest to your heart. In a world that forgets quickly, let us be the ones who remember slowly and pass it on.